Okay, you guys, welcome to week 4 of class. I hope you're all enjoying your Constitution Day seminar and whatnot. So this will be about maybe a half hour or 40-minute straight-up lecture with a few notes put up on the screen for you. The syllabus for week 4 says we're going to cover Tocqueville's reflections on Jacksonian-era political economy, and we'll look at some of the other changes in political economy of the Jacksonian era. Actually, what I want to do is postpone the reading material for this week until next week, because Tocqueville is much better done in discussion in class rather than by a lecture, either this way or through WebEx or something like that. So hold off on your Tocqueville readings until next week. Do the readings for the pre-Civil War and Civil War period, which aren't very many, and we'll cover all that next week. What I want to do this week is something that's not on the reading material. I was going to cover the welfare clause of the Constitution and how it has related to spending and how it has related to constitutional limits on the government's power to regulate and affect the economy. We talked last week about the Hamilton-Jefferson feud over the Bank of the United States, and that had to do a lot with the necessary and proper clause, but the general welfare clause is one that has come into play in a considerable way over the years. So, and then we may spend a few minutes at the end on the Commerce Clause and the police power, although I may also put that off till later because that's a subject that will unfold at great length as we go from here into the 20th century. So, let's begin. So let us begin by rolling back the calendar a few years to Hurricane Katrina. Some of you, I'm sure, remember Hurricane Katrina and all the criticism that the President Bush and the Bush administration took for being feeble in their responses to the hurricane and its aftermath. And in the immediate aftermath of the hurricane, not only was there disaster relief from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, but you also had Congress appropriating huge sums of money to rebuild New Orleans. In fact, the amount of money has been so large that if you add it all up and divide by the number of households in New Orleans, it comes to something like $200,000 per household in the New Orleans metro area. One wonders where all that money has gone. It's not entirely clear. But let that figure sink in a little bit and ask yourself whether all the households in New Orleans are $200,000 better off for all that aid. And then also keep in mind that New Orleans is known as one of the most corrupt cities in the country. But that's a subject for another time. More common is something you see happening all the time in large appropriations bills. And maybe the best example in recent years is every so often the administration, the Bush administration previously or the Obama administration now, has to go to Congress to ask for a supplemental appropriation to pay for the war in Afghanistan, or previously it was the war in Iraq, because those wars are not always part of the regular appropriation for the Department of Defense. Well, there was a detail that caught my eye in the appropriation back around 2007, I think it was. The administration needed $70 billion, I think, to carry on the surge in Iraq. And the bill that finally passed the House had all that money, but then it had a lot of extra things tucked in. And if you read through the thick bill, there in the middle was $25 million in assistance for spinach farmers in the Salinas Valley in California. How, you would reasonably ask, does the plight of spinach farmers in California relate to an appropriation for the Iraq war halfway around the world? And the answer, of course, is it doesn't. Why was that there? Well, the background was the spinach farmers had faced a wipeout, not so much because of bad weather or a failed crop, but because there'd been an outbreak of some kind of disease in bagged spinach salads and no one would buy their crop. And so it threatened to bankrupt a whole lot of farmers in the Salinas Valley. Up stepped their congressman, of course, a guy named Sam Farr. And essentially what he said was he's a Democrat, he didn't want to vote for a war appropriation. A lot of them don't, makes perfect sense. He said, I'm not going to vote for this, or I should say, maybe what he really said was, the price for my vote is I need $25 million in assistance for the spinach farmers in my district. And so it got into the bill. There was also $100 million in that bill for peanut farmers in the South who'd been affected by something or other. and $100 million for shrimpers along the Gulf Coast who also were in distress of some kind or another. That's ordinary congressional log rolling, as it's called. The log rolling is the famous phrase for, I'll support your cause or your bill if you'll support mine over here. That's as old as, it's as old as the deal we discussed last week, whereby Hamilton got Madison and the Virginians to sign off on his debt on his scheme to the national debt in return for putting the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., where it is today on the Potomac River in the mid-Atlantic. A classic first instance of log rolling, but it's done all the time in appropriations bills. So, the question for the class to ponder is, under what power of the Constitution can Congress pick out certain individuals or favorite interests and give them money from the federal treasury? Well, the typical answer is Article 1, Section 8, the clause that talks about the general welfare of the United States. Sometimes this is referred to as the spending clause. Well, how is a grant of money to spinach farmers in the Salinas Valley part of the general welfare of the United States? Now, this has been controversial from the very beginning. I think maybe the best statement on the subject of what the hazard is here was made by Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina in 1848. And here I'll put it up on the screen for you. And by the way, I'll have a lot of quotes here from people that aren't in any of the readings that you have in the reading packet or online. If you want to, pause the video if you wish to make notes on this, or you can always go back and rescreen this, of course. So here's Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina in 1848. If we permit an array of precedents, measures insidiously brought in under one pretext or other to govern our decisions, we shall find such precedents accumulating upon us. Constitutional barriers will be shaken down, and we shall find ourselves weaker and weaker every day, less able to resist the tide of encroachment, until we shall have no other constitutional guide save that which is prescribed by our own legislation. In other words, that last clause means only political barriers or public opinion will prevent us from giving money away to specific individuals and favored interests. Okay. This was said in 1848. I'll get up to the context of why he said that in a moment. But this idea that we would use the spending clause or invoke the general welfare to make an appropriation to a particular interest or a particular industry goes back to the first few years under the new Constitution. In fact, the very first instance of this was the Cod Fisheries Act of 1792. The Cod Fisheries Act of 1792 was an act to provide bounty payments to cod fishermen in the New England area. They were in some distress. There'd been a partial collapse of the fishery that year or something. And there was quite a controversy about this. And you had people objecting that the General Welfare Clause couldn't cover something like this. And so the Cod Fisheries Act passed, except they changed the form of it in an important way. It might remind you of the Obamacare decision to a certain extent. Because what they said was, as well, if it's not something we can justify under the General Welfare Clause, why don't we make it a tax rebate? In other words, they justify the Cod Fisheries Act under the taxing power, which is much more broad in the Constitution, and rather than the General Welfare Clause. So essentially they lowered taxes, port taxes on the cod fishing industry. No one doubts that Congress has the power to do that if they want to. Among the objections to the Cod Fishing Act was this one from Representative Hugh Williamson of North Carolina. And I've underlined, I think, the parts that will sound most ironic to us here in the 21st century. So here, you can read it along with me or for yourself. If we once established the doctrine of granting bounties under the General Welfare Clause in the hands of any good politician, the clause may supersede every part of our Constitution and leave us in the hands of time and chance. If Congress can apply money indefinitely to the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of the general welfare, they may take the care of religion into their hands. They may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of the public treasury. They may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. Let me pause here and note that, at the time that Hugh Williamson is talking in 1792, and at the time the Constitution is written, Everyone understands that education is the responsibility of state and local government and not the national government. This was actually believed to be the case well into the 1960s until the federal government decided, well, actually, we do want to get involved in education. And it's been all downhill ever since, you might say. In other words, more and more money comes from the federal government to schools and legislation along with it regulating the schools, right? That's what the No Child Left Behind Act is all about. Williamson goes on to say, they may undertake the regulation of all roads other than post roads. In short, everything from the highest object of state legislation down to the most minute object of police would be thrown under the power of Congress. For every object I have mentioned would admit the application of money and might be called, if Congress pleased, provisions for the general welfare. And that's a pretty good description of where we are today. Williamson concluded, here's the next slide, I, sir, have always conceived, I believe those who proposed the Constitution conceived, that this is not an indefinite government deriving its power from the general terms prefixed to the specified powers, but a limited government tied down to the specified powers which explain and define the general terms. It wasn't long before another idea of relief. I'm going through, by the way, the precedents here that are similar to the relief for disaster relief we're familiar with things like Hurricane Katrina. So in 1794, Congress passed a bill to grant aid to French refugees from Santo Domingo. There had been a violent uprising, a slave uprising in Santo Domingo, actually, which had caused about 2,000 French residents to flee to the United States. It was this proposal for only $15,000 for the relief of the French refugees from Santo Domingo that prompted one of the most famous statements of James Madison, which I have on display here. This is from the Congressional Record, as it was called then under a different name, the Journal of the House. He, meaning Madison, could not undertake to lay his finger on that article of the federal Constitution which granted a right to Congress, expending on objects of benevolence the money of their constituents. If once they broke the line laid down before them for their direction of their conduct, it was impossible to say what lengths they might go. The aid bill actually passed Congress, but once again, the objections to justifying it under the General Welfare Clause were sufficient that it was decided to justify this bill as a repayment of loans to France. In other words, it was swept up under the debt repayment plan, debt repayment appropriations. An earmark, you might say, an early earmark, so to speak. And so it became a matter of foreign policy, rather than using the General Welfare Clause to say, we're going to give direct relief to an ailing interest group or ailing individuals, right? Then in 1796, a bill came before Congress to provide fire relief for Savannah, Georgia, because Savannah had nearly burned to the ground. And that bill, only $20,000 was the amount contemplated. That bill lost in the House by a vote of 55 to 24, a pretty wide margin. Once again, you had people saying, we can't justify this under the General Welfare Clause. Representative Bacon, I have up here on the screen, he said such a bill would mean the United States is to become the underwriters to the whole Union. And then Representative John Nicholas said if the General Welfare Clause was extended to charity, it was undefined indeed. So you can see in those early years, while there was this inclination to try and use the public treasury to benefit particular interests, people who suffered misfortune, the tide of constitutional rectitude to say this is not necessarily constitutional was running pretty strong. In 1812, Congress passed a bill providing $50,000 in aid for Venezuela, which had been devastated by an earthquake. Once again, while some people said this could be justified under the General Welfare Clause, it was ultimately decided not to use that clause or invoke that part of Article 1, Section 8, but instead to call it a foreign policy measure. Now remember the date, 1812. Venezuela had just thrown off Spanish rule, and we were about to go to war against England. And so Congress justified this as a wartime measure. The next example comes from 1847, and it was a proposal to provide $500,000 for victims of the Irish famine, the Irish potato famine. Now, part of what was going on here is you had a lot of Irish immigrants, and the Whig Party, then in its decline, was trying to curry favor with the Irish vote in the next election. So here's an example of something we're quite familiar with in the 20th century, using people's money to try and bribe them to get their votes. This was defeated in the House or the Senate, and the arguments will sound familiar. Here's Senator John Fairfield of Maine saying, "Sympathy must not blind judgment or solemn obligations to support the Constitution. It was an easy matter to be generous and give bountifully from money or means not our own." Pause here, and you've heard the definition, the modern definition of a liberal is someone who is generous with other people's money. Well, here's a criticism of that inclination. The world would be full of charitable people if they could satisfy claims upon their bounty by putting their hands into the pockets of another. That was a very cheap sort of benevolence and would constitute a very small item in the great moral account. There is no more right to appropriate money out of the treasury to purposes not contemplated by the Constitution than we had as private individuals to lay our hands upon the property of our neighbors. None of the friends of this measure has yet attempted to put his finger upon the provision of the Constitution which authorizes it. So you can see that we had people who talked this way for quite a long time into the early decades of the Republic's progress. And then in 1866, the city of Portland, Maine burned to the ground, or nearly to the ground, and a bill for $150,000 was proposed to relieve the victims of the fire. And once again, we saw some of the same objections. Senator David Davis of Illinois said that although his heartstrings were pulled, there cannot be any more dangerous principle established in our government than that precedents shall make constitutional law. That sentence may be a little bit confused, at least in judicial terms. But he said, it is time for Congress to retrace its steps in relation to the licentious interpretation which it has been giving to its powers under the Constitution. And in 1867, you had bills proposed for farm relief in the South and flood relief in the Midwest. Some of these bills passed and began what you might say is the snowball effect of more and more such bills being proposed. Flood relief suddenly became very popular in the late 1860s and 1870s. Certain kind of relief bills for agriculture, especially where you'd had crop failures, they would provide money to buy new seeds for farmers and things of this kind. These bills still attracted a lot of principled opposition. Here's Senator Farnsworth of Illinois on one of the farm relief bills saying, "This is a new precedent, and if followed out to its logical consequence, we should hunt out the starving poor of every city and contribute to their relief." Or Senator Caldwell of Texas, "It will be a sad day for the Republic when the doctrine shall be generally received and admitted that there is no limitation upon the power of appropriation that our American Congress is bound to respect." Or Senator Willis of New York, "Wrong does not become sanctified by frequent repetition. It is time this spirit of restlessness and discontent which despises restraint and mocks at the doctrine of strict construction should be rebuked." Here's another quote you'll find from the congressional record in those years. Senator Bayard, I think of New York, I have to look up where. "Day by day, the doctrines and practices of a paternal government are speciously and tentatively expanding over the country, and the habit of popular thought is unhappily becoming accustomed to them. This constant intervention by government in tasks that belong to the individual and which American citizenship needs for its development and its proper exercise must cease, or ours will become as bureaucratic a government as that of Russia." You wonder what Senator Bayard would make of situations or conditions today, right? You'll notice here the emphasis on, or the implication here, is that you begin to erode the responsibility of citizens when the government takes into its hands charitable tasks that belong or are more properly or better done by the private sector. In 1887, Congress passed a flood relief bill for Texas, which President Cleveland vetoed in one of the more famous veto messages, and in one of the few remaining exercises of a presidential veto on what you might call old-fashioned strict constitutional grounds. Here's his veto message on the Relief Bill of 1887. I can find no warrant for such an appropriation in the Constitution, and I do not believe that the power and duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering which is in no manner properly related to the public service or benefit. A prevalent tendency to disregard the limited mission of this power and duty should, I think, be steadfastly resisted, to the end that the lesson should be constantly enforced that though the people support the government should not support the people. Wonder what President Cleveland would make of that item in the Democratic Convention recently, that government is the only thing we all belong to. And then finally, maybe the last presidential veto of a relief measure or a subsidy measure or a special interest measure on old-fashioned constitutional grounds is one that they made brief reference to last week. Mr. Dolbaus showed us the chart of farm bankruptcies, which spiked in the 1920s in advance of the Great Depression. And President Coolidge vetoed 2 farm subsidy measures. They were very similar, but he vetoed them both on constitutional grounds. And it's worth reading his entire veto message. I think I'll probably include it in the reading packet for later in the semester when we get to the Depression era again. But here at least is one part of his veto message I think you should take note of today for its continuity with people like Cleveland and members of Congress who objected to relief measures in the 19th century. Clearly this legislation involves government fixing of prices. It gives the proposed federal board almost unlimited authority to fix prices on the designated commodities. This is price fixing, furthermore, on some of the nation's basic foods and materials. Nothing is more certain than that such price fixing would upset the normal exchange relationships existing in the open market, and that it would finally have to be extended to cover a multitude of other goods and services. Government price fixing, once started, has alike no justice and no end. It is an economic folly from which this country has every right to be spared. So you see here, first of all, an economic literacy on Coolidge's part. But then he goes on to say, as he does right here, the granting of any such arbitrary power to a government board is to run counter to our traditions, the philosophy of our government, the spirit of our institutions, and all principles of equity. In both of his veto messages, Coolidge said, these bills are unconstitutional, despite the way Congress has tried to justify them by various means. So that may be the last time you saw a president stand up on old-fashioned principle on a broad relief measure of this particular kind. Even President Reagan signed off on disaster relief appropriations back in the 1980s. Now, the second category of the general welfare clause or the spending clause that aroused constitutional controversy involved internal improvements. So starting around 1815, coming out of the Second War with Britain, you had a lot of interest in having the federal government build roads and canals, and there was vigorous debate in Congress about this. And one of the reasons that especially the South, oddly enough, was for this is it was thought to be politically, it would promote national unity. A very reasonable and probably politically sound idea. But as was the case with relief measures, there was a lot of doubts among people like President James Madison, certain members of Congress, that internal improvements could be squared with the enumerated powers of Congress in Article 1, Section 8. So the first bill for internal improvements that passed in 1817 was sent to President Madison, and he vetoed it. In his veto message, he said, "I am constrained by the insuperable difficulty I feel in reconciling the bill with the Constitution of the United States." So I put up here on the screen a link to the veto message, the full veto message, and I included a few excerpts here in the next couple of slides, because one of the things that Madison does is he goes through clause by clause possible justifications for internal improvements and knocks every single one of them down, and saying it really fails the test of any of the internal improvements that you might wish to try to squeeze it under. So in the second paragraph here on the screen, He says the power to regulate commerce among the several states cannot include a power to construct roads and canals. So it's not part of the Commerce Clause. He goes on to say that you can't provide for it under the defense and general welfare clauses. I'll just leave this long quote up here on the screen for you to look at for a moment or two. So here comes Madison's closing argument, where he admits that he understands that roads and canals are important to the commerce of the nation, but he goes on to say that one of the problems here is that it would break down the partition of powers between the general and the state governments. In other words, it would erode federalism. And that is surely what has happened today in things like, all the federal grants and aid programs to the states that essentially turn states into adjuncts of the federal government. It is worth noting in passing that when President Eisenhower proposed the interstate highway program in the 1950s, it was justified in part as a national security measure. In fact, if you go look up the title of the Interstate Highway Act, it says something like National Highways and National Defense Act, which was not completely a trivial idea, by the way. Part of the design specifications for the interstate highways is that they wanted to have straight stretches of the highway every so often so that you could land planes on them in the event of war or invasion, which may seem kind of quaint today, but it still made some sense, I suppose, in the 1950s. Today, if the federal government wants to build solar panels or whatever you think of, they don't even seem to reach for that fig leaf anymore. Here's a great statement, a great general statement about the whole problem of internal improvements from Representative Drayton of South Carolina in 1828. And essentially what he's saying here is if it's up to Congress to decide what the general welfare clause means, and if we don't have any kind of self-restraint, well, guess what? We're going to be doing everything. In other words, Representative Drayton pretty much anticipated the world we live in today, a world where Congress of both parties can't be troubled to say no or draw any serious lines about spending. The third and closely related category of general welfare style measures that aroused constitutional controversy were land grants. Now, Mr. Wilson last week shared this chart with us showing public land sales in the decades before the Civil War, including that one very big spike there in the 1830s. Public land sales were one of the chief revenue sources for the federal government, as we mentioned before. And by the middle of the 1830s, the federal government was running some large budget surpluses, chiefly from that spike in land sales. And somebody got the bright idea in Congress, why don't we distribute some of this money back to the states? And by the way, why don't we give it to the states according to their population or their representation in Congress? Well, this raised a problem we're quite familiar with today, that some states would be donor states and some states would be beggar states, if you like. That was the phrase used then. Or it would be receiving more money back from the central government than they were paying in taxes. This is something that ought to be more controversial than it is, and it explains some of the behavior of Congress, where every member of the House goes wanting to bring back his share for the district. And if you're really good at this, like Senator Byrd of West Virginia was legendary for decades, you bring back much more than your state pays in, which means somebody somewhere is paying in more than they get back. And usually it's the large industrial states, New York, California, Illinois, I suppose. I'm not sure what the figures might be for Ohio. You can look these things up from year to year. This aroused an awful lot of controversy. And a lot of these ideas were voted down. Here's some of the criticism that appeared. Representative Robinson of Illinois referred to it as pensioning states. And he points out something that I think is a familiar theme today. Once you start sending money from the federal treasury to the states in whatever form, you start to erode state sovereignty. Representative Grundy from Tennessee makes the same point. States lose their independence. So, as was the case with President Madison on the internal improvements debate, so too on the public land sales and revenue sharing proposals, A lot of resistance to the idea of doing it, not simply because it didn't necessarily square with the General Welfare Clause, but because people understood it was a threat to federalism and to the independence and political autonomy of the states. A variety of land grants was simply giving away federal land. This was done most famously, of course, for railroad expansion, about which we'll have a lot to say in a few weeks when we get to the whole railroad subject of the railroad era, you might say. There was a proposal in 1854 to give away 10 million acres of federal land, which then would be sold off to support the mentally ill. Now, the backstory to this is something that I think we're quite familiar with. There had been a considerable public crusade on behalf of the mentally ill by Dorothea Dix. And the bill passed Congress, and President Franklin Pierce vetoed the bill on constitutional grounds. And here is the relevant fragment of his veto message. I cannot find any authority in the Constitution for making the federal government the great almoner of public charity throughout the United States. To do so would, in my judgment, be contrary to the letter and spirit of the Constitution, and subversive of the whole theory upon which the Union of these states is founded. In 1859, Congress passed the first bill to establish land grant colleges. That would include, I suppose, Ashland University or colleges like it throughout the Midwest. President Buchanan vetoed the bill on the same grounds that, or similar grounds, that President Pierce had vetoed the land grants for the mentally ill legislation. Here's part of President Buchanan's veto message. Should Congress exercise such a power, this would be to break down the barriers which have been so carefully constructed in the Constitution to separate federal from state authority. It would constitute a sort of partnership between the two in the Treasury of the United States, equally ruinous to both. I think, by the way, in this whole context of the relationship of states to the federal government, you really see it today in all of the demands, overt and explicit, for federal bailouts of failing states like Illinois, like California, like New York. This is going to be a significant issue starting in January, especially if President Obama is reelected. I think state bailouts to some of the failing states is going to be a part of any budget deal that is proposed. So keep your eye on that. But as you can see, it's not a brand new issue. It was very much alive in the middle of the 19th century. Okay, so I think that's about enough for a videotape class lecture for this week. But if you're interested in more on this subject, the classic work on this is a small book by Charles Warren called Congress as Santa Claus: National Donations and the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution. It's long out of print, sadly, and so it is quite hard to find, but it may be in your library or worth looking up on the second-hand book market. Let me recommend one other book to you this next week if you're looking for a good general economic history of the period between the founding and the Civil War that we'll be talking about in depth next week. It is Douglas North, Economic Growth of the United States, 1790 to 1860. Doug North is interesting because he won the Nobel Prize in Economics about 10 or 15 years ago. And this book's got lots of nifty charts and graphs like the kind we make in class. And if you're curious, all of the data sets and data tables are in the back of the book in the appendix. So you can make some charts of your own from back here if you want, although a great many of them are in the book. I'll talk about some important parts of this book next week and a few other subjects of that kind. But for now, bye from California, and I will see you all in class next Monday evening.
The diamond necklace played the pawn, hand in hand some drummed along, woke to a handsome man at baton. Upline class aristocracy, back through the opera glass you see the pit and the